Muy buenos días a todos los participantes en esta nueva
Good
edición de
morning
Diálogos Flar del Fondo
to all participants attending this webinar organized by Flar. I'm Fidel Jaramillo, Secretary General at Flar. I would like to extend my appreciation to all of my colleagues for hosting this event and all those attending this webinar through different platforms available. I hope that you're all eager to reflect upon the strengthening the global financial safety net and the regional financial arrangements in the current global context. This is the subject matter of this webinar today. This is particularly important taking into account all the risks we are being exposed to. The experience in Latin America has shown us several times that we need to be ready to address any adverse shocks and build resilience in order to maintain financial stability. In order to address this topic, today we have a keynote speaker, Mr. Jose Antonio Ocampo. He is a Colombian economist from Cali. He holds a PhD degree from Yale University and extensive experience on international organizations and institutional centers. He was Minister of Finance during 2 terms in different moments and hard times. He was also Minister of Culture. He was the director of the Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and he was also a member to the UN in different positions. Right now, he's a lecturer at the University of Columbia. He's going to be delivering a presentation of about 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor for discussion in order to address some of the topics that he will be covering during his presentation. I'm honored to now give the floor to Professor Jose Antonio Ocampo. Thank you very much, Fidel, for such a kind and warm introduction. I would like to extend my appreciation to Mr. Jose Uribe, the chairman of FLAR, as well as Carlos Giraldo, for having me today during this presentation. By way of introduction, and let me start by showing my presentation on the screen and sharing it with you. By the end of June, early July, the 4th conference organized by the United Nations will be taking place in Seville. This event was first held in Monterrey back in 2002, to be followed by another one in 2008 in Doha. These have all been very interesting conferences, and after 10 years, another one is going to take place in Seville. So the Spanish administration put in place a task force in order to prepare the agenda for this conference. They invited us to put forward some specific proposals, and they entrusted me with the coordination of this task force. So now let me share with you the ideas that have been prepared by this group of experts, which show what other bodies are now discussing. And this also, of course, involves some regional organizations such as FLAR. This is therefore the agenda for today's webinar, which is quite comprehensive. This is the list of all the topics of the conference I have just described. I'm going to underscore those highlighted in yellow. During this conference, the topics that will be covered are the following: strengthening the global financial safety net, the resolution of sovereign debt crisis, and today I'm going to therefore focus on the global financial safety net as well as the resolution of sovereign debt crisis. There will also be some topics concerning regulatory aspects and some critical institutional topics. So let me start by the first set of topics. We need to consider how IMF's actions are to be reinforced, as well as regional networks. This is what I call critical institutional matters that need to be covered. The first topic that we are presenting as a proposal is the following. We believe that it's very important to strengthen credit facilities for low-income countries, including access to regular credit facilities. This may not have many effects in Latin America, but the opposite applies to African countries. Some progress has been made in this regard, and for some time, low-income countries can now have access to regular credit facilities. Next, strengthening and enhanced access to contingency facilities. Here we are talking about the flexible credit line that can be found in several Latin American countries. This is a line of credit that countries may opt to use or not. There's a quota for this purpose. I'm not saying that this is an alternative to accumulating international reserves. As I used to say to my students, this is a overdrawing credit facility that countries have, and the only country that has used this facility has been Colombia. They used this FCL some time ago. There's another contingency line that has been provided for some time now, and that I'm going to explain how can be obtained at a larger scale. This is a clear response to another topic that is related to the third topic on the list. There is pro-cyclical access to foreign financing in emerging economies at reasonable prices. But during book times, there have been some restrictions and the funding cost has been high. Historically, therefore, since the late 19th century and early 20th century, developing countries have been building up many international reserves in order to be ready to cope with a decrease in foreign financing. This contingent credit line provides an alternative for countries not to need to build up many international reserves in order to cope with crises. Thirdly, we could create a mechanism in order to intervene in emerging countries' bond markets and in developing countries in times of crisis. Bond prices tend to go down while interest rates go up during these periods. As a result, the IMF could use this mechanism to intervene in these markets by purchasing bonds and therefore preventing interest rate hikes. This mechanism would be suitable so that coupled with the prior one, this pro-cyclical behavior of external financing could be addressed. Next, we have the strengthening of regional institutions and networks. This is another topic that I will be dealing with during my presentation. And then we have other aspects that have to do with protecting social spending during crisis times. This is an area of concern of the IMF. And next, rules about national governance. I would say that the IMF has tried to prevent funds from being used for corruption purposes, and that's why these standards have been put in place. The IMF assessed this at its evaluation office. They do not have, however, all the resources required to deal with governance-related matters. Therefore, this should not actually be a condition to be imposed by the IMF. Okay, now let me refer to the history of funding provided by the IMF. This chart depicts all the funds granted by the IMF over global GDP. There were two spikes. Well, actually, back in the 50s and 60s, developed countries used a portion of these funds, mainly in Europe. But subsequently, as of the 70s and 80s, the countries borrowing funds were emerging economies or developing countries. So here we find a spike in terms of indebtedness, and another spike took place during the crisis in Asia. So the demand for funds has come down significantly. There was another financing spike during the European crisis in the Eurozone. But over the past years, developed countries have not actually borrowed. However, in these countries, these rates were quite low, even if we take into account the COVID-19 pandemic and the interest rate hike landscape. Next, we should discuss SDRs, so special drawing rights by the IMF. This is also part of this topic concerning how we strengthen the global financial safety net and RFAs. I'm going to show you a chart that depicts that virtually 900 billion US dollars have been issued in SDRs, but only 5% is being used, about 30 to 40 million US dollars. Therefore, this is one of the most widely resources that we find in the international system. There are different proposals in this respect. On the one hand, we could speak of increased and more regular allocations. The past two issuances took place during global financial crisis, including Bretton Woods. However, $200 billion US dollars could be issued in SDRs by the IMF in order to keep SDRs as part of total reserve assets internationally. Next, there has been an increased stake in allocations. This is another debate that could have, but I believe that this is quite unlikely to happen. The third proposal, in my opinion, has a better potential. Here we are talking about different accounts of the IMF. This is another proposal that was put forward back in the 70s, and this was also endorsed by an expert group. SDRs that were not used should be considered as deposits of IMF countries. As a result, additional resources would be available, and then we could also have contingent credit lines. And the other option is that those funds could be allocated to special funds that could be better managed by multilateral banks for all kinds of programs. There is a fiduciary fund for sustainability and another one for poverty. The question is whether these trusts should be managed by the IMF or by the World Bank or other similar multilateral banks, and that seems to be more reasonable. In creating these funds, it is important to guarantee SDRs so that all countries contributing to those funds can actually withdraw the funds at any time so that they can really be considered to be international reserves. This means that they have to be over capitalized so that funds are available at any point in time. These are some examples of SDR issuances. There were 4 historical issuances. And here you can see the share of low-income countries in this chart, which is very low. And then you can also see the share of medium-income countries, excluding China. It's very important to determine how these allocations are to be carried out. Such allocations have taken place in all sorts of forms throughout history. In 2022, this issuance was quite positive from the perspective of Latin American countries, and these countries received between 0.7 to 0.9% over their GDP on account of SDRs. This was a very high proportion over their GDP. And this, of course, helped some economies, for example, Venezuela. Next, how are sovereign debt crises handled? This, of course, affects the IMF, and the IMF and the World Bank are the bodies responsible for conducting studies on developing countries' indebtedness. We could provide 2 solutions for this purpose. On the one hand, a solution to handle the current crisis. Thinking about the Latin American history, we could consider a plan B. That is treaty concerning how the debt should be dealt with. This was prepared by the G20, or an alternative document could also be provided. And I hope that this topic is going to be discussed during the conference in Seville as well as during the G20's conference to be held in Africa. Most of the countries using these mechanisms are African countries. The negotiation process was very slow, and these mechanisms did not prove to be very useful. It's very important to guarantee that all stakeholders participate actively. And secondly, it's important to include medium-income countries as well. That's another issue that leads to debt overhang. Next, it would be important to consider bond aggregation, which is another mechanism that has been developed for quite some time, since the early 21st century. Next, we need a permanent institutional framework that is a framework that over-indebted countries can use in order to go through a debt workout process. I believe that this is more feasible because developed countries could support this approach. When at the beginning, there were some arguments whereby this decision should be independent from the Board of Governors of the IMF. Another possibility would be to do some debt workout based on my own knowledge on the mechanism used to resolve disputes by the International Trade organization, I believe that some arbitration or mediation procedures could also be applied. This is an example of some analysis conducted by the IMF and the World Bank. As you can see here, in the case of low-income countries, the situation at the beginning of the century was a bit complex, and the goal was to cancel their debt as of 2005. Then we have medium-income countries whose debt overhang level also came down since the beginning of the century. But over the past years, the reverse has occurred. And now almost 30% of developing countries require that their debt level is cut. From an international financial regulatory perspective, we have several initiatives. For example, including environmental risks as well as financial risks. That is to say, any credit facilities that are aimed at particular investments should take those risks into account. This is something that European countries have been doing. Also, in Colombia, there are mechanisms in place to deal with this approach. And thirdly, well, actually, first off, we need to decide how we're going to strengthen regulations on international capital flows into developing countries while avoiding any debt overhang or over-indebtedness. Chile, Colombia, or Brazil in the past applied some mechanisms in that respect. This topic was already addressed by the IMF on several occasions, and they decided that under certain circumstances, it would be appropriate to intervene international capital markets or the countries foreign debt, and this is something to be done by central banks in order to avoid any debt overhang. Second, we could allow and coordinate the regulation of digital assets and currencies privately created. I believe that this is quite interesting because this is a highly volatile market, which does not apply traditional regulatory procedures. As a result, many of these assets collapsed, causing many people to lose their resources. So in some countries, financial brokers are banned when it comes to using these resources. This therefore depends on financial regulation in each country. And next, in Latin America, this is particularly important because the shadow economy normally uses this means, like, for example, drug trafficking players use these means in order to transfer their resources. For that reason, this should all be clearly identified in order to put in place any necessary regulations or in order to pursue any illicit activities. Okay, let us now touch upon some critical institutional topics. Here we're talking about the voice and participation of developing countries within the Bretton Woods bodies or organizations, talking about special drawing rights that take into account the contributions made by countries to the IMF. They are all out of date. As a matter of fact, 50% of such resources were reduced 2 years ago. And now it is going to be discussed again as it happened back in 2008 and 2010. However, contributions by countries has not been updated as of late. That is to say, their contribution to the world economy. This is quite a complex issue. Some developed countries, when they want, they don't want to get these big contributions mainly from China, as it happened back in 2010. It is important to increase the votes that are assigned to each country, like in the United Nations, where all countries are alike despite of their size and population. This is another mechanism that is also very important for small countries as well as for low-income countries or poor countries, small countries such as those in the Caribbean region or Central American countries. These are therefore special contributions, and I believe that this is very important. In 2008, 2009, their participation was increased. Current participation, however, accounts for half the amount provided for under the Bretton Woods arrangement, where countries would be assigned a 9% of basic vote. So both the World Bank and the IMF would have to increase these basic votes that are assigned to countries. Next, it is important to have open systems and transparent systems in order to appoint the managing directors of these institutions, and all countries could propose their own candidates. Therefore, in the case of the IMF, well, European countries could propose a candidate. Next, how do we build what I call a stronger global architecture with strong regional institutions in place? This is typical of multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank or the regional banks that we find all over the world. In the case of Latin America and the Caribbean region, there are 3 additional banks, the CIF, the Central America Development Bank, among others. Therefore, this is a very strong network with international, regional and sub-regional institutions. We need to create more regional funds, and we need to strengthen them in order to allow for significant participation as a financing facility that should be available to the countries where they operate. These institutional or regional institutions provide countries with a stronger sense of belonging. In federal systems, states find themselves to be stronger because they feel that they belong to a whole nation. And for this same reason, small countries usually have a greater participation at such institutions. Therefore, response to regional demand happens to be much stronger by such bodies. This is another slide that depicts the size of regional balance of payment facilities at present. The only ones that really have a significant weight are the European Stability Mechanism and Flar. The latter happen to be particularly important for all those countries that are members of FLAR, and we hope that more countries will continue to join FLAR going forward. And I hope that at some point in time, FLAR can become a Latin American and Caribbean reserve fund. One of the strengths of FLAR is that it provides heterogeneous facilities that can be used in order to deal with that overhang. For example, by issuing contingent credit lines, as it happened with Colombia some time ago. This is also suitable for other countries such as Ecuador. Ecuador received many more funds from FLAR than from the IMF, so this should be further developed. There are other facilities which do not have a significant weight, such as the Chiang Mai Initiative or the BRICS Contingency Reserve Arrangement, which I believe that does not exist at all. Then we have the Arab Monetary Fund. This is comprised mainly of commercial loans. Then we have the North American Framework Agreement, which has not been used either. So there are two funds that have a significant weight here. On the one hand, the ESM, and then FLAR, which I insist has played a very important role for all member countries in the region. All countries that are member countries to FLAR have been aided by this institution. I stop here and now I open the floor for discussion. Thank you very much, Jose Antonio, for describing the challenges that we are facing for achieving international financial stability, debt management. This is an ambitious proposal in order to rebuild governance by multilateral institutions and in order to promote global cooperation. Let me get started by asking an overall question, let's say. We happen to be at Monterrey together. I represented CAF at that time, and you were the representative of ICLAC. That was the first summit on development of financing. And now we will be attending the fourth conference that will be taking place in Seville. So I reviewed the first conference on development, that summit that we shared in Monterrey, and at the time, similar topics were covered. I remember that movie where Bill Murray was sort of caught up in the same situation, in the same moment. In this case, we are going to be sort of caught up in the same agenda. Let me ask you this first question. Which developments have taken place over the past decade in this agenda of economic development, and what has actually kept us a little bit lagging behind? Okay, let me start out by talking about the debt-related issues. Actually, these debt-related issues happen to be quite significant for low-income countries. Afterwards, indebtedness was reduced by using public funds. There were also some arrangements with development banks and with the IMF. This was quite an ambitious proposal. There is another problem that has worsened over the past 10 years. And here we're talking about debt overhang or indebtedness. There are many facilities that do not seem to be adequate to solve the issue. Some progress has been made by multilateral development banks or regional banks. Today have a greater weight compared to the World Bank when it comes to financing. Here I'm including the Asian Infrastructure and Development Bank. This is perhaps one of the banks that has grown the most. The Chinese actually consider this bank to be their own, and they are willing to present that bank as a major development bank. In the case of Latin America, the CAF grants more loans compared to the Inter-American Development Bank. And they account for a significant source of financing for all member countries. Therefore, some progress has been made in this sphere. In the case of financing for development, we are sort of a standstill, and resources, or the allocation of resources, has been coming down over the past years over the GDP of developed countries, with standing at 0.7%. And right now, with the virtual cancellation of US aid, that situation is worsening further. Resources received over the past years by low-income countries have been shrunk over the past years. Additional resources have been allocated actually to Ukraine or refugees. Progress, however, has been made, although to a limited extent, for environmental purposes. For example, for the fight against climate change. New resources have been allocated for that purpose. Last year, after the summit was held, there was an additional increase on the allocation of such resources. As for international monetary systems, I believe that the new facilities made available by the IMF are quite positive, the same as others that were issued back in 2021. However, at a regional level, I believe that we are a little bit stuck, not only in the region, but actually worldwide. The BRICS arrangement did not work, and the Chiang Mai initiative is another example. Therefore, one of the reasons leading to this over-indebtedness is to be attributed to the pandemic. The pandemic led to a high death toll, as well as to increased indebtedness, going from 60 to 75% over GDP in Latin America. It has not been reduced since then, and now we're likely to experience a rebound. How can we leave or exit this situation, taking into account that there is no single recipe that can be applied to all countries? You made a distinction between low-income countries or poor countries, for whom having a common framework could be a good response. However, the response given to such countries has been quite slow. But what happens with medium income countries or high income countries, which are right in between? These countries are not too poor to receive certain facilities, but they are not rich either to access capital markets at competitive conditions. What should we do in order to provide an adequate response to such countries facing different challenges? Well, this framework should be overhauled dramatically based on three elements. African countries that used these facilities had some delays. Also, all creditors should be actively involved, whether we are talking about private creditors or lenders that sometimes do not participate much, or China. China did not participate in that framework either. Therefore, we should include all lenders. And thirdly, medium income countries should also be factored in. We drafted another proposal. whereby there should be an international reporting framework about countries' public debt. There should be an international debt register. Many of these debts are contingent and they are related to the price of staples or basic products. Very often, such debt is not recorded as debt by countries. We should have an international debt record, therefore, containing that information. That issue can be sorted out by putting in place a new framework or overhauling the current framework to cover all countries. Besides, there could also be a standing institution to deal with this situation. Latin America is perhaps not the worst in the world. There are other countries which are much worse off. All our countries can be considered to be medium-income countries. Argentina and Ecuador have been involved in some debt workout, but we cannot say whether they have succeeded in doing so or not. Medium-income countries seem to have a complex situation because debt levels are high, public finances continue to be under pressure, and many resources are being allocated to other purposes out of the medium income trap. What should they do to reverse that? Well, interest rate hikes over the past year had a full impact, apart from COVID-19, because interest, in addition to the invasion of Ukraine, interest rates are sliding down, but very slowly. In the United States, they remain at quite a high level. Right now, there are some arguments in the United States. Nobody knows whether the Trump administration will trim interest rates or not. People believe that so far there has not been a significant reduction of such rates. I believe that a common framework should be put in place in order to include medium-income countries such as ours. As for SDRs, after the pandemic, I think that that was quite a significant facility that you underscored during your presentation. However, the issuance of SDRs in some countries over their GDP was quite asymmetrical because based on quotas, most of SDRs went to high-income countries that did not actually need those SDRs. Afterwards, that was changed, but too slowly. So can we consider that the recycling of SDRs could be accelerated and that could be allocated to medium-income countries and not only to multilateral development institutions or bodies, or also including regional financing arrangements, RFAs? Well, I believe that they should be considered to be deposits held by member countries of the IMF so that they can use those resources more effectively. They are sometimes used for no purpose in 95% of cases. If there is a source of funding that we can say is available now, well, those are the SDRs. The IMF has created some own funds. Those funds should be invested in funds that could be, for example, for environmental financing. That's something that could be done by the World Bank to combat climate change. this should be part of any renegotiation. And the same happens with RFAs. The CAF could use those funds for financing to Latin American and Caribbean countries. Now, talking about the recycling of SDRs, well, that is not actually happening. So I wouldn't even try to go in that direction. I would rather analyze how funds have been used by countries. Even though interest rates on SDRs have increased a little bit, taking into account the reference currencies used to estimate SDRs, they are quite moderate. So these funds could be used at a large scale in order to carry out moderate projects. But taking into account the scope of the Resilience and Sustainability Fund in order to finance other projects to increase productivity or to develop infrastructure. Would that be an option? Would that be the only one? No, actually, we could have different funds. These funds were created for that particular purpose. These can be used by medium-income countries or for developing countries in order to develop their infrastructure and production fabric or for their own technological transformation. This is the aim to be pursued by development banks. These SDRs should therefore be deposited in those funds in order to generate resources. The international financial architecture you described is very interesting. On the one hand, there are some international, regional, and sub-regional development banks that have played an effective role, and that has been one of the most significant changes over the past 2 decades in strengthening some institutions such as the Caribbean Development Bank, among other institutions. That development, however, did not take place within those organizations that are aimed at promoting macroeconomic stability or RFAs. We have the IMF, but at a regional level, they do not have the same performance or they did not grow as much as development banks. What options do we have in order to strengthen this global financial safety net, and how can we use these tools and any new proposals found in this document so that RFAs account for a first line of defense in order to face adverse shocks. For example, volatility of capital flows, interest rate fluctuations, and interest rate spreads. Well, we should create them because they do not exist, or if they do not exist, or increase their scope if they are already in place. But I would add something else. In my opinion, the Shine Mine initiative and the BRICS arrangement did not actually tie their loans to other loans granted to the IMF. One of the strengths of FLAR is that is totally independent from IMF, which renders it much more agile compared to the IMF when it comes to granting funds. In my opinion, the Jan Mine initiative did not work for that reason, the same as the BRICS arrangement, which was created but was actually never used. Therefore, we could think about an African fund. Other countries could also join FLAR in the Latin American Caribbean region. So it would be sort of a CAF, or should have the same kind of membership as CAF. So all members could contribute more resources, or new members could join. So we could increase the scope, as it is the case of FLAR. The IMF should act as a monetary fund indeed. We have to consider what's going on in the world right now. This is perhaps not the subject matter of this webinar, but actually there are many geopolitical developments that are taking place due to the Trump administration in the United States, war conflicts, trade disputes, multilateral institutional changes that all having an impact on prosperity and the pace of economic globalization. Prior to the tariff war triggered by the Trump administration, trade barriers threefolded since 2017, reaching 3,000 last year. It is quite likely that they will continue to threefold without the World Trade Organization actually counterweighing that, as you pointed out in one of your publications. According to the fund, this geopolitical fragmentation will reduce international production by 7% in the long run. That accounts for 7.4 billion US dollars, or the GDP of Germany and France. Just to give you additional context, there is additional fragmentation, such as sanctions, restrictions to capital flows, also cancellation of climate deals and immigration controls, all of which will pent up global instability. This creates a highly volatile landscape, as well as a very uncertain financial landscape. Yesterday, the US stock exchange tumbled with one of the most significant falls since the beginning of the year. Do you think that the global financial safety net and the regional financial safety net are ready in order to face this potential instability of financial systems and increased stress? How can we reinforce these nets in the face of this multilateral crisis, and what could international bodies do as a first line of defense in order to counterweight these adverse shocks? There are certain considerations that go beyond the responsibility of the monetary funds. Yesterday, the US stock exchange collapsed, and that was the most significant drop since Trump took office. Then the tariffs policy and other restrictions that have already been enforced, for example, on China and on steel and aluminum imports. On April the 2nd, there will be new announcements, and we'll have to wait and see what happens with Canada, Mexico, and the rest of the world. Neighboring countries are not actually immune to these kind of actions. And this can have some spillover effects on the world economy. Monetary funds cannot do much in that backdrop. Monetary funds can be used in order to manage balance of payment crisis. However, up until now, no capital outflows is observed in the case of developing countries. On the contrary, it seems that they are becoming quite attractive, even It sounds paradoxical, but amidst the current uncertainty, there are some funds that are now seeking to invest in other regions. Monetary funds are used in order to manage balance of payment crises. We have to wait and see how this world trade will affect BOPs. Monetary funds, however, can play a role to promote alternative systems or contribute to integration in order to defend the region against international economic declines. How can we be more attractive in the face of current global instability? In the past, regional integration was a response to that. However, Latin America is now going through one of the worst times in history in terms of integration mechanisms. Virtually all arrangements are going through very dark hours. So how against this background, how can we reinforce multilateral arrangements in order to defend ourselves against such instability? When I attend conferences in Mexico, I always tell them, well, you have to look southwards. I believe that now Mexico will start looking southwards and perhaps will be more keen on integrating itself into the Latin American region. This is a political initiative that should get through, that is to say, reinforcing regional integration. The 90s is a good example. After the debt crisis, the Mercosur was created as a result, perhaps the fact that Argentina would withdraw from Mercosur would be awful because it would interrupt the main commercial flow that takes place at present between Brazil and Argentina. What about the relationship between Europe and Latin America? In the past, we thought that the EU was going to organize Ibero-American summits in order to reinforce a common strategy and in order to counterbalance the power of the United States. Do you think that we are in a crisis situation right now, and the fact that Europe is now moving away from the United States, don't you think that we could use this opportunity in order to strengthen regional bonds? Absolutely. Europe now has the possibility to reinforce their bonds with Latin America because it's moving away from the United States. The Trump administration has also announced 25% tariffs to be levied on Europe. So we can understand that Trump is affecting neighboring countries, but what about Europe, with whom the United States has also had a good relationship? So maybe we should look to Europe in order to harness other opportunities. China might ultimately be the big winner here, as I have written in an article recently. We will all start looking to China and perhaps India as potential markets. India is not right now a key player in the world economy. They're going through a lot of domestic development, but nonetheless, in the future, this might change the world map. So we should absolutely reinforce our integration processes. Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. It's been a fascinating discussion, an excellent presentation. We have gathered many takeaway messages. I would like to extend my appreciation on behalf of Flar, my colleagues, and the audience. for having contributed to this in-depth discussion. Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. Thank you all for attending this seminar, and let me remind you that this presentation will be recorded and subsequently distributed. Thank you very much for attending and have a very nice day. Thank you for the invitation and thank you to all.